The manuscript source that we've used for the DECIMA GIS is it's a tax census from the middle of the 16th century, taken from the city of Florence, which is the famous home of the Renaissance. It has an interesting history of its own. In 1537, Florence comes under control of Duke Cosimo I. He's the first real Duke of Florence. He's a Medici scion. He's from a minor member of the Medici family, and when his cousin is murdered in 1536, he rushes into the city to claim the throne. Cosimo is recognized as being an innovative ruler, as being a bit unorthodox. He's widely expected not to last very long because he takes the throne at 17, but he ends up being one of the longer reigning Medici dukes. He rules until 1564 in his own name, and through his son until 74 when he passes away. Cosimo is, part of his innovation and part of experimentation is that he's really into data. He's really into collecting data and knowing things about his rule, right? So he's kind of following in Machiavelli's steps, is that he's got to be aware of who his people are, and he's got to at least make efforts to appear to care about them, right? So he institutes a number of these sorts of census-type documents. In 1550, he commissions a census of the city's convents, where the abbess of a convent must list in order of when they entered the convent, and therefore in order of seniority, all of the sisters in her convent. In 1551, he commissions a first decima, and then in 1561, which is the manuscript we're using, he commissions a second decima, which builds from the experience of the first one, expands its fields of inquiry, and grabs more and more data. So it's part of a process during the 16th century, not common only to Florence, but happening in many of the absolutist states that seem to emerge. Is this desire to get some knowledge of the state and to make some kind of informed governing decisions. So the 1561 decima is a tax census. Decima means tenth, which is a tithe. So it's supposed to be a 1/10 tax based on immovable property, based on real estate. The problem is that he never actually institutes this tax, as far as we know. So it seems to be kind of a one-off data collection. And here we get to the interesting crux, because the 1561 copy of the census is very much an economic document. It describes physical properties, and it describes their values, and it describes the professions done by the people who own them. It's very much a prosopographical and economic document. However, in 1562, the scribes created a presentation copy as a gift to the Duke. And this one, they stripped out all of the economic data entirely, and it's only nominal data. So you have two very different documents working at different purposes here that are actually from the same project. And one of them, the 1561, is a measure of the Duke's assets, the taxable income that he can expect to have based on the immovable property of the city. And the second, the 1562 copy, stripped down of everything but nominal data, is a measure of his liabilities, the mouths that he has to feed across his state. So it's the purpose of the Decima Granducale is an assessment of Cosimo's reign, of his assets and his liabilities. It's preserved it's preserved because of the notarial culture of the time, which is assiduous at just writing things down and putting them in archives. But it's never repeated. It doesn't seem to have been looked back on. It doesn't seem to have been used for anything. But it's put into the Grand Ducal archive and conserved until the 20th century when we started using it, when historians. Well, the Decima project does not stand in a vacuum, obviously. It comes from a developing line of what we would call digital humanities projects, I suppose. And in fact, one of the original digital humanities projects is the transcription and databasing of the 1427 Catasto of Florence, which is done by David Herlihy and Christian Clapiche-Zuber. Now, this work was revolutionary in its approach to Renaissance Florence, because the first time we had got a full picture of the inhabitants of the city, of their gender breakdowns, of their family lives, of their incomes, of their properties. And that really was revolutionary in kickstarting the sort of deep microscopic social history of Renaissance Florence, which emerged in the 80s and 90s. So DECIMA builds off of that tradition of creating pictures of city life and of city populations, of opening up the people of the city itself to historical analysis. It's also based upon more recent work using the same map and the same census that we are using. It's a book by Robert Litchfield called Florence Ducal Capital, and in that he employs the same census that we do and the same map that we do to create a more static version of the system that we've created. So we are trying to take this developing field and make it more interactive. So one of the things that DECIMA is able to do is to allow the user to query the map himself. Rather than just taking what the map presents to you, we are able to go into it and ask questions of it. And that, I think, is its biggest contribution, is that it opens up this city full of people to our questions in a way that we previously didn't have. We can do things on both individual scales, community scales, citywide scales. It's quite fascinating. Well, the project has been collaborative at 3 levels, I would say, and each of them has offered challenges and opportunities. And at its most basic level, there's a team of us working on the database and the map at the U of T. There's my supervisor, who's the principal investigator, and there's myself, who's sort of the lead research assistant, and then at various times we've had between 2 and 4 graduate or undergraduate student researchers doing data transcription. This has presented challenges in just managing academics, managing scholarship, but also making sure that when you have 4 people inputting to a database, that you have standards, that you have consistency in how it's done, and that at the end, the beginning looks more or less like the end, and that they can at least talk to each other. So this actually took a few tries to get right. There were definitely processes of going back to the database and cleaning it up and making everything consistent. At its second level, we've collaborated with broader groups at the U of T in order mostly to take from their expertise, to learn from their expertise. So when it came to building the website, for instance, we had to we drew on the assistance of IT at U of T in Toronto, who have been extraordinarily helpful in helping us with technical support in building the GIS portal for us, and then in providing the server home for the site as well. And that has been wonderful. We've been blessed with a really helpful and enthusiastic information tech team, and then they've been really good. At the international level, we're collaborating with scholars in North America, Europe, and Australia, and this has probably been the most both rewarding and challenging part of the collaboration. Through it, we've been able to set up a kind of marketplace of ideas where we have been trading access to the DECIMA for people's data that they wish to use with the DECIMA. So in this sense, we've had a really interesting conversation where everyone has been able to benefit the project itself, our own understanding of it, and then also some significant projects from major scholars in the field. And the results of that collaboration will be appearing in an edited volume due out in March called Mapping Sense, Space, and Movement in Florence. Collaboration is necessary in these projects because there's a wide variety of skills that go into it that most people do not possess all of, and also because the sheer amount of work that goes into these projects is too much for one person. You look at the DECIMA now, and it seems like it functions very smoothly, and it's a contained ecosystem that works intuitively. It was not always like that, and it took hours and hours and hours and weeks and months of programming, of coding, of transcription to make it function for us. And without a team, that can't be done. So it has both opportunities and challenges, but I think the opportunities generally outweigh the challenges. In relation to the previous question, this collaboration is going to force us to reconsider what produced scholarship looks like. And this is where I say there will be a place for the monograph, but there will also be a place for the group project that results in a robust and rigorous technological project. This is absolutely one of my favorite parts about the DECIMA project, is that it does function on so many different scales, such that you can look at the entire city as a whole, or you can trace the life of one person through that city. So for instance, I mean, at its most macro scale, the DECIMA is an economic analysis tool, right? Its most basic data fields are property values and rents paid. So at our most macro scale, we can tell you the average cost of a house in Florence. We can tell you which neighborhoods are the wealthiest. We can show you the value of every single building in Florence all in one window. That doesn't mean that much when you see it, because it looks like 9,500 dots of various colors and sizes. But when you move, so that's sort of the start of your analysis, and that's where GIS becomes very helpful, is that the macro sort of starts you off and gets you interested and prompts your first questions. So when you see that map of house values, something will ting in your head, and you'll say, oh, I want to know what's going on in this neighborhood. And so you zoom in and you learn a little bit more about the workers of that neighborhood, or which professions dominate that neighborhood. And then you zoom in a little further and you look at how many of them have large families and stuff like that, right? So you can start at the macro and then zoom right in. But the GIS also allows you to just answer micro-historical questions and to trace individual lives, to trace individual families, to draw connections between individuals and groups. One of my favorite projects that we've run through it is on mental illness and family relationships, and it's by Liz Mellon at the University of New Hampshire, and she's interested in the Martelli family, one of whom is mad, we think he's epileptic. Liz was curious to see if this branch of the family was weirdly related to the other branches, or if there was any indication that the other branches of the family were slightly wary of them. And as it turned out, this was entirely the case. We mapped all the Martelli around Florence, and then most of them are in one neighborhood, pretty much all in one street, except for our epileptic fellow and his mother and his brother. All lived out significantly towards the edges of the city in what we call the suburbs now, and they're kind of relegated out to the outside because they're a little bit embarrassing to the rest of the family. So you can do these analyses at all levels, right? You can go from the highest level of analyzing property among 50,000 people in Florence, or you can trace one person, and then you can find out where Michelangelo's workshop was, for instance. That one's in there. We've been very fortunate to receive funding and significant support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and under their granting program, grants come in stages. So the first grant was a preparatory grant, during which we transcribed the database and did the initial coding of the map and created the initial phase of the project, the sort of base layers, and then at every stage of the grant, we've also tried to put out something alongside it, some small publication. So the first phase of the grant resulted in it was more or less an announcement of things to come. It was a 5-page piece in the Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies. Then we've tried to also, every year, we've tried to bring people together and have a workshop or a conference that demonstrates to the funding body that we are continuing along this path, that it is producing work, but that given the nature of it, it can't produce a new book every year, but it can produce a meeting, it can produce discussions, it can produce collaborations, and it can produce new ideas going forward at least every year. So we're now in the second phase of the grant and are preparing the book. The book is coming out in March for it, and then the third phase of the grant is a large internationally collaborative grant, which will then allow us to think more seriously about what the final publication is out of this, or if there's a final publication, or what the sort of format of moving knowledge from the DECIMA into the academy is going to be, how we publish. And we'll have some conversations around that. We're going to get bigger. Right now, we're focused just on 1 year in Florence, but currently we are transcribing a census from 10 years prior, the 1551, and that will allow us to compare the city 10 years apart, compare both home ownership and also home residency. Beyond, so we're going for temporal comparisons as well. Change over time is the historian's gold standard. We're also going to be expanding our geographic scope. So as we bring in more collaborators, they're not all interested in Florence. So we're going to be moving to other cities. Next up will be Bologna, mostly based on sort of as we come across data sets and as we come across interests and maps, we'll add them. What's the last one? Time. And then different types of data. Right now we have, so we're providing sort of census data as the base from which to do different kinds of analyses. As social historians, you need to know who the people are first and foremost. But then we want to start adding other data sets on top of that allow us to compare the base layer of the census to other phenomena in the city. So another one that's coming in, for instance, if a plague hits a neighborhood, we can track its morbidity as a proportion of the total population in the neighborhood, because we know the total population of the neighborhood on the base layer of the census. So there's, working with the census as a base layer, we're going to continue to add any kind of data that you can map, essentially. And so it's going to become a much more robust clearinghouse for early modern social inquiry.